Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Today's daf is Daf Yud Aleph. We start from 4 lines from the bottom of Daf Yud Amud Beis. Tanan Hasam. We learned in a Mishnah later on in Zvachim. Shahir Rabbi Kiva said, "Kol damim shenichnas aleichel lepar lechaper psulim." Any dam of any carbon that's supposed to have the dam on the outside of the mizbeach hachitzain, the zrika has to be done on the outside. If you bring it inside, lechaper al manas lizroik. In other words, you want to bring it inside the heichal to be mechaper, to be zerikit on the inside mizbeach, even if you weren't zerikit yet. Big machlekas tanaim later, but either way, from any carbon, it will passel the carbon. As long as it's a carbon that's supposed to be on the outside mizbeach, you bring it into the heichal al manas lechaper, then it passels the carbon. That's Rabbi Kiva. Chachamim say no. Chatas bilvad. Only by a chatas, which is a chatas chitzoina, a chatas that's supposed to be in the outside, and you bring the blood of a chatas into the heichal, that's a mefurish pasuk in the Torah. So it's only what's mefurish in the Torah, and that's it. Rabbi Eliezer Omer afa asham. Rabbi Eliezer says also an asham shnemer kechatas ka'asham. So we have Rabbi Kiva Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer. How expansive is the halacha by a chatas? That if you bring the dam of a chatas chitzayin into the heichal, it passes the carbon. Chachamim say only chatas. Bliyaz says afa osham chatas ka'osham. The Torah is makashit. Rabbi Kiva says all zvachim. Says the Mishlam Rabbi Eliezer the kamer taima. Eliezer brings a reason. It says kechatas ka'osham. It's a hekish. El Rabbanan my taima. Why do the Rabbanan hold it's only by a chatas if there's a hekish? How are they going to refute the hekish of Rabbi Eliezer? Rava said, "Osham nichnas domei lefnim pasla matzasam mekavachomer ma'oila." It's a oila. It's a kavachomer from oila that holds the chachamim back from agreeing with Rabbi Eliezer. Why? What's the kavachomer? Ma'oila shehi kolol. Oila, which is chomer because it gets consumed completely on the mizbeach. Nichnas domei lefnim ksheira. If you bring the blood of an oila, which is a more chomer carbon, it gets consumed on the mizbeach achitzin. And you bring it to the heichel, it's kosher. Osham she'ena kolol, like oshkena osham, which is not as chamer, right? It's more kal. Torah doesn't require the entire carbon to be consumed, to be burnt on the mizbeach. Like oshken, that it's not going to be possible if you bring the dam into the heichel. So the Gemara says, not such a good kal v'chaymer. Mala oilish kenena mechaperes. What do you mean? Osham has a milo that it's mechaper. Oil is not mechaper. So maybe because it has a milo that it's mechaper, that's why if you bring the blood into the heichel, it passes the carbon. So the Gemara says, Minchas Choyte will prove to you that even though it's not really mechaper, and Minchas Choyte is what? A Choyte, well, I'm sorry, it is mechaper. Minchas Choyte is the mincha of a ani, right? Of a carbon oil of a yored, there are 3 tiers, we said, right? There is the mincha tier, the lowest of the low, the poorest class. Then we have an oifis, and then we have mamash de behemoth for the rich. So the mincha, right, really is mechaper. It's like a chatas, minchas choyte. It is mechaper. So it's going to prove to you that even though it's mechaper, still, if you bring it into the heichal, it's not possible. Why is it not possible? By the way, because it's not dam. Only dam becomes possible if you bring it into the heichal. A mincha is kmitza. There's no dam there. So you see, even though it's mechaper, the kapara is not what gives it the chomer of passeling it when you bring it into the heichal. The Gemara wanted to say maybe Osham is different because mechaper, and oil is not mechaper. The Gemara is showing you minchas choyte, a mincha has the mile of being mechaper, and still it doesn't become possible if you bring the kmitza into the heichal. The mincha? No. Mincha is brought into the mizbeach achitzin. You put the kmitz on the mizbeach achitzin. Right, it's not shaykh. Right, and that's why it should be possible if you bring it into the heichal. Right? Because you took a wrong turn. Right? That's the whole shaila over here. If you take a wrong turn with something that's supposed to go on the mizbeach achitzin, and you walk into the heichal with it, what are you doing in the heichal? You're not supposed to be there. This doesn't belong anywhere in the heichal. It belongs in the mizbeach achitzin. So Rabbi Eliezer wanted to say, just like the Torah says by chatas chitzayna, somebody shechts chatas chitzayna, brings the blood into the eichel and is supposed to go into the mizbeach achitz and it passes the chatas. So to an asham kechatas ka asham, it's a hekish. So Gemara wanted to know, Chachamim who don't use the hekesh, why taka don't they? So Rava said, because they have a kavachomer in telling you that a osham, you shouldn't passel the carbon if you bring the blood into the heichal. How do I know it? From an oila. Oila is more chomer because it's kolol, and if you bring the blood, it's not a problem. Kavachomer osham, which is not as chomer, it's kal because it's not kolol and mizbeach. If you bring the blood, it shouldn't passel. So the Gemara to say no, oila, it doesn't passel because it's not mechaper. But osham is mechaper, so maybe since it's mechaper, so maybe it does passel. So Gemara says, no, minchas choyta will prove to you that even though minchas choyta is mechaper, still if you bring the kmitza into the heichal, instead of bringing it where you're supposed to belong onto the mizbeach achitzain, it's still kosher. So you see that kapara doesn't really play a role in whether it's...
There's no shaykhs though to the...
Oh, excellent. Karanoira. The Achronim ask what you're asking really. What kind of teichiach is it? Minchas choyta doesn't have dam bachlal. It's no shaykhs to our conversation. That's really what you're asking, right? Oh. Okay, very good kasha, yeah. Okay, Velema chatas ha'oif techiach asks the Gemara, why don't we say chatas ha'oif techiach? What's a chatas ha'oif? Chatas ha'oif is the second tier of carbon oil of yared, right? The lowest class brings, the poorest class brings a mincha, second is a oif, and the third is a behema. So why don't you prove from chatas ha'oif? Lamaisa chatas ha'oif is a better proof. Why? Because it has blood. Mincha doesn't have blood b'chlas. So prove from something that has blood that even though it's mechaper with the dam, if you bring the dam into the heichel, it doesn't become puzzle. Says the Gemara, chatas ha'oif boy Rabbi Avani. No, chatas is not so posh. It's a boya. It's a boya later, so that's why we don't want to bring up chatas ha'oif over here. Okay, Gemara says v'lifra yichmala minchas choyta shekein eina min zevach. Oh, really, you're a kasher doctor. Why do we have a pircha on this eichacha? Huh?
Yeah, it's a different category.
Different category altogether. Yeah, it's mamish. It's not a min zevach b'chlal. So Gemara says oila techiach. No, oila will prove to you that even though it is a min zevach, but if you bring the blood, it doesn't passel. Between the dam of the oila and the kmitz of the mincha, you see from both of them that even though shein kache kodeshem, they're both kodesh kedoshem. Yeah, because the minchas choyta is a chatas. Chatas is always kache kodeshem, and the oila is certainly kache kodeshem. And yet, if you bring the blood into the eichal, it's kosher. So afani yevi yasham shekodesh kedoshem v'nichas dam lafneim kosher. Okay, so bottom line is the reason why the Chachamim don't agree with Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that asham is like a chatas, that if you bring the dam of the asham into the heichal, it passes the carbon, because there's a tzad shava from oila and minchas choyta that prove to you that if it's kodesh kedoshem, it doesn't necessarily passel if you bring it into the heichal, so to asham. Okay. There's a pirch on the tzad shava. Why? Because by oila minchas choyta, there's no requirement on how much you have to spend when you bring a carbon. By an asham, there is a requirement, there's a minimum of shnei shkali kesef. You have to spend the minimum amount on a carbon. So you see, there's a chumrah by an asham. So maybe because of that chumrah, maybe that's different. If you bring it into the heichal, bring the dam into the heichal, it's going to passel it. So it's not a good tzad shava. Elahainu tamai the Rabbanon. So the Rabbanon really argued Rabbi Eliezer for a different reason. They don't have a tzad shava anymore. We fall away with that. The Omar Kra, because the pasuk says dama. It says in the pasuk where it says if you bring the dam of a chatas, it's possible. It says v'chol chatas hashiyuva mi dama. Dama shalzu, the karm chatas, the dam of a karm chatas, if you bring into the eichal, is possible. V'loy dama shal acher, but not the dam of an osham or any other carbon. The idach, what's Rabbi Eliezer going to do with this miyat of dama? How can he compare chatas to osham? So the Gemara says no. He dashes dama differently. Dama v'loy basara. He excludes the basar, which means if you bring the dam of the chatas into the heichal, that's when it passes the carbon. If you bring the basar, a little bit of the basar, that's not a problem. The idach, how do the Rabbanan darshan from? Yeah, how are they going to be mamayit the basar? It says dam dama. Yes, a dam dama. Okay, an extra hay. The idach, dam dama le darish. Okay, he doesn't darshan these two drushes. So bottom line is we have machlikas Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer, whether asham is like a chatas in the sense that it becomes possible if you bring the dam into the heichal. The Rabbi Eliezer has a hekesh of kachatas ka asham, and the Rabbanan have a miyat by chatas as dama, dafka dama, so you can't darshan that hekesh. Bishtam the Rabbanon asks the Gemara, Damri Oshem Sheshchata Sheloi Lishmoi Kosher. I understand according to the Rabbanon our Mishnah. Yeah? Our Mishnah in Machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Tanakama whether Oshem Sheloi Lishma is possible like a chatas or it's kosher. So the Gemara wants to take apart now that Machlokes based on what we just said. Let's go back to the Machlokes in the Mishnah. Rabbanon say Oshem Sheshchata Sheloi Lishmoi Kosher. Yeah? I understand why Oshem that Yishech Sheloi Lishma is kosher, not like a chatas that's possible. Yeah? Hainu de iskash mincha lechatas mincha le'asham. The Tanya Reb Shimon Omer, Kodesh Kedosha Mika Chatas V'cha Asham. I understand why mincha is compared to a chatas and a asham in the Torah. When the Torah talks about a carbon mincha, it says it should be like a chatas and like an asham. What does that mean? Reb Shimon Omer, Kodesh Kedosha Hi, L'gaba the mincha, it says Kachatas V'cha Asham. What does it mean? The mincha has certain parts of it, parallels to a chatas, and certain parts of it that are parallel to an asham. The Gemara says like this: Minchas choytarei kechatas lefikach k'matzah shlo lishma psula. It's like a chatas in the sense that if you do the kmitza shlo lishma, just like you do the shchita by a chatas shlo lishma pasels, so to do the kmitza by a minchas shlo lishma also it's pasel. Minchas nedava rei ka'asham. If it's a minchas nedava, then it's like an asham. Lefikach k'matzah shlo lishma ksheira. Oh, very interesting. So according to the Chachamim, that split makes sense because the Chachamim say a chatas shlo lishma is possible, but a asham shlo lishma is kosher. So you compare a minchas choyta to a chatas and minchas nedava to an asham. Ela Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, holds that asham is also shlo lishma possible. So they're both the same. Chatas and asham are the same. So lamai l'chasa iskish mincha l'chatas and mincha l'asham. So why did the Torah compare to chatas and the asham? If chatas and the asham have the same halacha according to Rabbi Eliezer, that shaloi l'shma is possible, so just compare to one of them. Why is the Torah comparing it to both of them? Yeah, what are the unique qualities of an asham that you need to compare mincha to an asham for if you already compared it to a chatas? So the Gemara says, l'chi'idav de Rebbe Shimon. He's going to darshan it like the other drasha of Reb Shimon. Datnan shaloi b'kli sharis psula. If you bring a mincha, the kmitza of a mincha, onto the mizbeach, shaloi b'kli sharis. Usually the kohen has to take the kmitza and put it into a kli sharis, and then bring the kli sharis to the mizbeach where he's makter the mincha.
Together with the
Levina. So the Gemara asks, so what is Rabbi Eliezer going to darshan kachatas v'cha'asham by mincha? L'chidach der b'shem detnat shloi b'kli sharis psula. Tanakama says in Menachos in the Mishnah over there Daf Chavav that if you take the mincha, the kmitza of the mincha, not in the kli sharis, so it was never put in the kli sharis, it passes the mincha. Reb Shimon machshav. Amar Reb Chia. My time to Reb Shimon. Amar Kro. Kodesh Kedosh Mikachatz v'cha'asham. Torah says that a mincha is like a chatz and a asham. What do you mean a chatz and a asham? Bola oivda biyad, oivda biyamin kachatas. Which means if you want to be moilich the kmitza onto the mizbeach with your hands, then you can be moilich it with the yad yamin, right? Like a chatas. Just like by a chatas, the kohen has to use his right hand to sprinkle some of the blood onto the mizbeach, right, with his etzba yamanis. So too, if the kohen decides to use a mincha or to do the avoida with the mincha, with the kmitza, like a chatas, which means bring it with your hands, it's okay. Yeah, kodesh kedosh mikachatas, or ka'asham, bichli oiv de b'smail ka'asham. If you decide to do the klisharis and bring it up to the mizbech, bring the kmitza onto the mizbech with the klisharis, then you take the kmitza b'smal, and you put in a klisharis and ka'asham, it's kosher like an asham. Okay, so the Gemara says, so it depends, our machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabban of the Mishnah, whether asham shlo lishma is possible or not, right, would also determine how to darshan the ka'asham by a mincha. Yeah? If you hold asham shlo lishma is kosher, then mincha ka'asham means minchas nedava ka'asham, that it's kosher. If you hold asham shlo lishma is like a chatas, it's possible. So what does it mean? Mincha is like an asham? It means that you could bring it either biyad or b'kli sharis. So Gemara asks now. Both drushes are darshan from the same pasuk, and they're both Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon Aikra mapik le'lachi, mapik le'lachi. How could Reb Shimon darshan both drushes in the same pasuk? Yeah, you gotta make up your mind. Either the mincha is like a chatas and a asham with regard to shaloi lishma, or the mincha is like a chatas and a asham with regard to kli and yad. So the Gemara says, the Iker pasuk is really teaching you like Rav Yehuda Brei Rav Chia, which means a minchas chayt the psula shaloi lishma time me'achrinahu. It's really teaching you the din of yad and nekeli by a mincha, the last drasha. How do I know minchas chayt the psula shaloi lishma? That's a different reason, because chatas time b'may dechsiv bo. It says by chatas who. It says chatas who. Minchas chayt na miksiv bo he. It says also he chatas he. So just like we learn from a chatas that shaloi lishma is possible from the word who, minchas chayt you also learn from the word he. So really, Reb Shimon doesn't really darshan it from kachatas and ka'asham by mincha, right? That's not how he darshans that a minchas chayt is possible shaloi lishma. He darshans from the word he. So the drush is available completely to the way Rav Yehuda Brei Rav Chia darshans it, which is that you can be makriv the kmitza either biyad or bekeli. It doesn't matter. Okay. Now the Gemara asks another kasha. Ula Rabbanan. According to the Rabbanan that hold that if you shech the asham shaloi lishma, and the asham that you bring the dam of that asham into a heichel, it's all kosher because you're not makish it to a chatas, right? So lamai hilchas iskish asham lechatas. Lamai Rabbi Eliezer has a gewaldige source for his comparison. It says the Torah says kachatas ka asham. They have to treat a asham like a chatas. So Rabbi Eliezer says that's why just like a chatas shlo lishma is pasul, asham will also be pasul kachatas ka asham. Or just like a chatas where you bring the dam of the chatas chitzayna into the heichal, it's pasul. So to an asham. So the Gemara says, so if the Rabbanan argue on that, so why did the Torah say kachatas ka'asham then? So the Gemara says, the Rabbanan tell you a different halacha. Ma chatas tu'una smicha, af asham ta'un smicha. There's no din smicha before the Torah by an asham. So he learned smicha from chatas from the hekesh of kachatas ka'asham.
Isn't smicha a standard protocol? Any
Aha. You're saying it's standard protocol by any kachi kaddish.
you don't need a special
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I'm assuming from the Gemara's answer that it's not. Assuming from the Gemara's answer that it's not.
It's one of the avodas hakobonos. It's not one of the avodas hadam, but it's avodas hakobonos.
Okay. Sounds like you needed a pasuk for an asham. You needed a. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the Gemara. Yosi ben Chayni Omer. We learned in our Mishnah, there's a Shita Yosi ben Chayni who says that if you take any carbon and you shecht it l'shem Pesach, take a carbon Erev Pesach, take a shlomim Erev Pesach, and you decide to shecht it l'shem Pesach or l'shem Chatas any time of the year, it's pasul, it passes it. In other words, just like a Pesach and a Chatas that are shechted l'shem shlomim become pasul, so to a shlomim that's shechted l'shem Chatas or l'shem Pesach, on Erev Pesach it becomes pasul. It works both ways. That's Yosef ben Chayni's shita. Rabbi Yochanan, Yosef ben Chayni v'Rabbi Eliezer, Amru davar echad. Rabbi Eliezer agrees to Yosef ben Chayni as well, that if you take a shlomim and you shecht it l'shem Pesach bezmanoi, which means an Erev Pesach, then it passes the shlomim, or if you shecht it l'shem Chatas on any other day of the year, it passes the shlomim as well. Rabbi says, ba'achirim l'shem Chatas pligi. They're only choylek ba'achirim if you take a shlomim and you shecht it l'shem Chatas. That's where the machlokes is. So they only agree by a shlomim l'shem Pesach bezmanoi, but not by a shlomim l'shem Chatas b'shayim v'sashana. There's a machlokes. Okay, now the Gemara is going to bring the brisa for the makar of Rabbi and Rabbi Yochanan, the Tanya. Ha-Pesach she'avrish nasai. Carbon Pesach that got too old. Yeah, right? It's supposed to be within a year, less than a year, and that's already 2 years old. Ishchotoi bizmanoi l'shmoi. And you shechted it on the 14th of Nisan in the afternoon, Reb bizmanoi, Erev Pesach, l'shmoi l'shem Pesach. Right, so... So here, Shaila is going to be considered a shlomim. Because Lamais, it's possible for Carbon Pesach, it's too old. But everything else you did right. You shechted it, bismano, you shechted it l'shma, Just the only problem was it was too old. It was too old. Or another case. What happens if you take a shlomim, on Erev Pesach, and you shech the shlomim l'shem Pesach? Yeah, a person is coming to the Azara, and he brings a shlomim, and all of a sudden he sees a commotion in the Azara. He sees everybody's crowding around. He says, "What's going on with this?" Everybody's shechting the carbon Pesach. He says, "You know what? I want to be part of the crowd. I'm going to take my shlomim and bring it to the Pesach line." And he shechts a shlomim l'shem Pesach bezmanoi. So here, again, you have both are Erev Pesach, l'shem Pesach, but one is a shlomim, one is a Pesach that's too old. Rabbi Eliezer.
What makes a shlomim before shchita?
I say harei olai harezu shlomim.
It's a shlomim, but it's the exact identity as Korban Pesach as far as the.
Well, Korban Pesach shlomim needs nesachim. There are different talachas that shlomim has. Korban Pesach doesn't.
Yeah, but that's after the shchita.
No, it's b'shasta hakdosha. How do I classify this animal when I makdash it? Did I say harezu pischi? This is my Korban Pesach. Did I say harezu hekdesh b'kedusha shlomim? What kind of kedusha did I give it? So if I took an animal, I said harezu shlomim. Now I have to bring it as a shlomim, right? That's what the whole pasuk is, that you have to do kasher nadarta, the way you were neider, the way you said you're going to bring it. But here he didn't. Here he said, you know what? I'm going to bring it as a Pesach bizman and erev Pesach. Rabbi Eliezer says a shlomim l'shem Pesach on erev Pesach is puzzle. You got to get rid of it. Rabbi Yeshua Machshir, Yeshua says no. It's still fine. It still can be brought as a shlomim in both cases, because the Pesach she'avar shnasa, it's too old for a Pesach, right? But here you shechted a shlomim l'shem Pesach, it doesn't work, and you still bring it l'shem shlomim. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Omer Rabbi Yeshua. Now we're going to get involved in the conversation. It's back and forth with Kal V'Chaimers. We're going to hang on tight over here. A little bit of a hard Gemara. Omer Rabbi Yeshua. In Bishar Yemois Hashana, she'ena kosher l'shmoi. If in the rest of the year, right? If let's say during your midwinter break, you want to try to bring a Korban Pesach, l'shem Korban Pesach, would it work? Avadanat. B'shar Yemois Hashana she'ena kosher l'shmoi. You try to bring a Korban Pesach during January, it's going to be a problem, right? It's not kosher. Right? The Torah says you can only bring a Korban Pesach the 14th after Chatzos. So you can't bring a Korban Pesach, l'shem Pesach, during January. And still, acherim, ksherim l'shmoi. But if you shech the shlomim during January, in January, l'shem Pesach, it's still a good shlomim. Yeah. Because Rabbi Eliezer only passes karbonis that are nishchat, l'shlomim that's nishchat on Erev Pesach, l'shem Pesach. But if it's in January, l'shem Pesach, that's kosher. Right? That's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. So Rabbi Yeshua says like this. If you try to shech the Pesach in January, l'shem Pesach, it's not good. And still, if you shech the shlomim in January, l'shem Pesach, it is good. So Kal V'Chaimer, so too, bizmanoi shu kosher. So if you shech the Pesach during the Zman, which is Erev Pesach, l'shem Pesach is kosher. Ein odin sheyichshiru acherim l'shmoi. So certainly, if you try to shech the shlomim on Erev Pesach, l'shem Pesach, it should be okay, right? So basically, the
unique halacha by Korban Pesach, B'shar Yemois Hashana is a shlomim. That's only a klal by Korban Pesach, not by
true.
else.
But that klal, that works even though if you try to take a Korban Pesach itself and you shecht it l'shem Pesach, then it wouldn't work.
No, it only
Wouldn't work. So the Pesach doesn't work at that time of year. Yet, if you take a shlomim at that time of year and you try to bring it l'shem Pesach, it does work.
Yeah,
It works. In other words, what Rabbi Shua doesn't like is you could bring a shlomim l'shem Pesach even when you cannot bring a Pesach l'shem Pesach.
that's because it's the two different circumstances.
No, in the same January. In January, you can't bring a Pesach l'shem Pesach, yet you can bring a shlomim l'shem Pesach.
There's no such thing as a Pesach l'shem Pesach.
Correct.
Any other time.
Correct. So it says Rabbi Yeshua. So in a time where you can't bring a Pesach l'shem Pesach, yet you could still bring a Shlamim l'shem Pesach, it would still work.
Would work
So
with the Shlamim.
as a Shlamim, but l'shem Pesach is not going to passel it.
This is impossible. It's impossible to be a Pesach then.
Okay, but
A Shlamim could be a Shlamim 365 days a year.
but if you bring a Pesach l'shem Pesach, it's passel.
Of course.
It's not a Shlamim. It's passel legamri. Yet you could bring a shlamim l'shem Pesach, it would be a shlamim. In other words, you could bring a shlamim l'shem Pesach, it would be a shlamim, even though you can't bring a Pesach l'shem Pesach, it'll be pasal legamri.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So if you could bring a shlamim l'shem Pesach at a time when you can't bring a Pesach l'shem Pesach, kal v'chaymer when you can bring a Pesach l'shem Pesach, certainly you should be able to bring a shlamim l'shem Pesach.
You're comparing apples and oranges.
Okay. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer is going to answer a little differently. Rabbi Eliezer, whoa, 1 second. Once you go tap into such a logic, I'm going to use it against you. How am I going to use it against you? I'm going to flip it on you. How so? Imma in b'shar yimois hashana she'enai kosher l'shmoi kosheru l'shem acherim. Let's focus on the Korban Pesach itself. In January, if I tried to bring the Pesach L'shem Pesach, it doesn't work, and yet if I try to bring it L'shem Shlomim, it does work.
Yeah.
The Korban Pesach itself, in January, if I shecht L'shem Pesach, pasul. If I shecht that Korban Pesach L'shem Shlomim, it's okay, right? So, oy bazoi bizmanoi shehu kosher l'shmoi, on Erev Pesach, which is manoi, where if I shecht it L'shem Pesach, it's good. So kal v'chaymer, if I shecht it l'shem shlomim, it should also be good. It should be at least a shlomim. Yeah? If when I shecht it l'shem Pesach in January, it doesn't work. Yet if I shecht it l'shem shlomim in January, it does work.
Yes.
So kal v'chaymer, if I shecht it l'shem Pesach at a time where it does work, which is Erev Pesach, kal v'chaymer, if I shecht l'shem shlomim in Erev Pesach, it should work. And that's for sure not true. That's for sure not true, right? Because that's the Mishnah. So the Gemara says like this. So Rabbi Eliezer says, "I'll prove your logic wrong, Rabbi Yeshua, because I could use it in a wrong way. If I try to shechta Pesach in January, l'shem Pesach, it's not kosher yet kosher l'shem acherim. It's kosher if I try to do it l'shem shlamim." So bizmanoi on Erev Pesach shu kosher l'shmoi. If I shech the Pesach on Erev Pesach l'shem Pesach, einoi din sheyuchshar l'shem acherim. So if I shech l'shem shlomim, certainly it should work on Erev Pesach. And ebazoi v'yuchshar Pesach barbas shloi l'shmoi. And now based on that logic, you're going to kasher a Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach shloi l'shmoi. Kachat oimer. This is what you want to tell me? You're going to use that type of logic to kasher a Korban Pesach Erev Pesach l'shem shlamim? Makes no sense. Okay. So the Gemara says, not just that. Now Rabbi Eliezer digs in. He says, not just that, I have another kasha. Mali hochshuru acherim b'shar yemois hashana l'shmoi shekenu kosher l'shem acherim. In January, if I shecht other karbonis L'shem Pesach, it works. That's because it also works the opposite way. When I shech the Korban Pesach L'shem other karbonos, so it works both ways, a two-way street. You have Shlomim L'shem Pesach works in January, and Pesach L'shem Shlomim works in January, right? So that's why it works both ways, right? So it works both ways in January, so let it work both ways in Erev Pesach also. V'yuchsheru acherim bizmanoi l'shmoi. So on Erev Pesach, when you shecht other karbonos l'shem the Korban Pesach, it should work shekain hu pasel l'shem acherim, because this is going to be pasel l'shem acherim. You can't kasher it. Yeah, you need to have a two-way street. Either it works both ways, or it works in no ways. That's what Rabbi Eliezer wants to taina. Rabbi Eliezer says, just like in January, if I try to shech the shlomim l'shem Pesach, it's kosher. Because if I try to shech the Pesach l'shem shlomim, it's also kosher, because it works both ways. So to Erev Pesach, it's got to work both ways. You got to stay consistent. Rabbi Eliezer is arguing consistency. You got to be consistent. If in January it is kosher both ways. If I shech the shlomim l'shem Pesach in January, it's kosher. If I shech the Pesach l'shlomim, it's also kosher. So now you got a pasul on Erev Pesach both ways as well. Yeah, if you shech the Pesach l'shem shlomim on Erev Pesach, it's pasul. If you shech shlomim l'shem Pesach, it's also pasul. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yeshua. 1 second. In Cain, if you're taka right with that logic, that you're going to pasul karbonas acherim, the other karbonas on Erev Pesach, if you shechted l'shem Pesach, hayrata koyach Pesach v'nasata koyach b'shlomim. You now diminished, you weakened the koyach of a carbon Pesach, and you gave more power to a shlomim. Why? Because in a certain sense, shlomim will be more chomer from Pesach. Why? Because a Pesach that's nishchat for shlomim, in the zman of shlomim, right, is kosher. Meaning if you shech the Pesach l'shem shlomim in January, it's going to be kosher.
Yeah.
Right? But if you shech the shlomim l'shem Pesach in the zman of Pesach, it's going to be puzzle. You're going to give more power to shlomim than carbon Pesach. And we know that's not true because carbon Pesach is for sure more chomer than shlomim. It's kares. Right? So you can't tell me a logic that would equal more power to shlomim, right? Because that means Shayim is a shana. If I take a Pesach, a shechted l'shem shlomim, it's good. Shem shlomim is more power, it's good. But if I take a shlomim and I shechted l'shem Pesach and the zman of Pesach, Erev Pesach, you tell me it's no good, it's too weak, it's no good? That doesn't make sense.
But again, you can't compare the two because of the time limitations of Pesach. Pesach is different than Shlomim. It's restricted to the time when you can shech there.
To the 14th.
The 14th until Chatzos.
Yeah. Yeah, so you want to tie in that's why it passes by Pesach.
That's exactly. Pesach is highly limited. Plus the halacha of Pesach, you show you most shona shlomim. So it's comparing apples and oranges. Even though it's kachkalim, but they have different
Right.
characteristics.
Right. Yeah, but how could a Pesach have more of a kula than a shlomim?
It also has a chumrah.
Shlomim has a chumrah that it becomes puzzle. I think I said it wrong. I made a mistake. Shlomim on Erev Pesach, according to Rabbi Yoel, if you take a shlomim, you shechted l'shem Pesach, yeah, it's going to be puzzle. That's a chumrah of shlomim. It's not going to work. If you take a shlomim, you shechted l'shem Pesach and Erev Pesach, it's puzzle. And yet if you take a Pesach, Shayim Mois Hashana, and you shechted l'shem shlomim, it's kosher.
What about Pesach and Erev Pesach and you use a shech l'shem shlomim?
Okay, that's not, okay, true, that's not where he's asking from. He's asking from a shlomim and Erev Pesach.
That's the parallel situation. Because you're talking about Erev Pesach, you take the shlomim l'shem Pesach, it's possible. So the reverse of the coin is Pesach l'shem shlomim and Erev Pesach. And that's possible.
Because the reverse you're saying is Pesach.
That is the equal reverse.
That's the equal reverse? Again, Pesach, because Pesach l'shem, okay, 1 second. So you're saying that the opposite of Pesach b'shayim or Sashana l'shem shlomim would be, is not shlomim l'shem Pesach and Erev Pesach.
That's right.
Right.
It's not inequality.
Okay, but it's true, it's not an equality, but it doesn't have to be an equality. We're just looking at the two separate parshas of Parsha of Pesach and Parsha of Shlomim, and based on, according to Rabbi Eliezer's logic, what would come out is that carbon Pesach, we're more kal with the carbon Pesach than we are with the Shlomim. Shlomim we're more chamer with. Because Shlomim and we can't have Shlomim be more chamer than Pesach, period. So Rabbi Yeshua is telling Rabbi Eliezer, according to you, what you're going to do is, you're going to be hayrata koyach Pesach, you're going to tell me that Pesach is weaker than the Shlomim because a Pesach b'shayim b'sashon l'shem Shlomim is kosher, but Shlomim is more chamer, because Shlomim and Erev Pesach l'shem Pesach is possible. You can't have that. You can't have a Pesach more lenient than Shlomim. So Gemara says, Chazar Rabbi Eliezer v'donai din acher. So Rabbi Eliezer went back and said, okay, you know what? I have a different svara, I have a different taina why I say that a Shlomim on Erev Pesach l'shem Pesach is possible. How do I know that? Because Matzinu Moiser Pesach Bashlamim. We find that Moiser Pesach, let's say you had a behema that you're makdish for a carbon Pesach, you couldn't bring it, and now it's left over. You can't bring it anymore as a carbon Pesach. So what do you do with it? What do you do with it? Makdish Shlamim. So you see Matzinu Moiser Pesach Bashlamim. You see that you can convert a Pesach into a Shlamim. Ve'ei Moiser Shlamim ba Pesach, but you can't convert a Shlamim into a carbon Pesach. So Umah Pesach. So according to that, you can dash the following Kal V'Chomer. Umah Pesach Shemesari Bashlamim Madcha Pesach that you can turn into a Shlamim. Still, Shachte Bizmano L'Shem Shlamim Pasul. If you Shechte Bizmanoi L'Shem, meaning on Erev Pesach L'Shem Shlamim it's Pasul. Yeah, Shlamim She'ein Moisarin Ba Pesach. Shlamim that Bachlal is not Shaykh to carbon Pesach, right? Because you can never convert a Shlamim into a Pesach. So vadim shachtem l'shem Pesach b'zmanoi. If you try to shech the shlamim l'shem Pesach b'zmanoi, and this you psul, then vadim should be possible. Okay, so that's a new kind of svara. I came up with a new kind of kal v'chomer. Yeah, if you see that a Pesach that could be converted into a shlamim, still if you shech that Pesach l'shem shlamim on erev Pesach, it's possible. Certainly a shlamim that can never be converted into a Pesach. If you take a shlamim, you shech l'shem Pesach b'zmanoi, certainly it's going to be possible. Rabbi Yoel, if you're going to dash such type of kal v'chomer, I'm going to use it against you. Watch what I'm going to do. Metzinu moiser chatas ba'oila. You find that a chatas can be brought as an oila. When can a chatas be brought as an oila? What? How do you have a moiser chatas?
He set aside one, it got lost, and then he got another one.
Oh, yeah. You set aside two, and you put one as an insurance policy, and you didn't end up using it, so now it's a chatas, an extra chatas. So what happens? You can be makriv as an oila. So moiser chatas can be turned into an oila. Ve'ein moiser oila b'chatas, but a oila can never be turned into a chatas. So now let's use the following logic that you just used over here. That can be turned into an oila. Still shachtel l'shem oila psula, even though it has a shaychus to an oila essentially, because sometimes a chatas could be brought as an oila by moiser chatas, and still if you shech the chatas l'shem oila, it passes. Oila she'ein moisara b'chatas, an oila that can never be turned into a chatas. So shachtel l'shem chatas ein adin she'tei psula. Certainly, if you shecht an oila shem chatas be puzzle, and we know it's not. The halach is not like that, right? An oila shloila shmas kosher. So bazoi, the logic is false. Your logic is wrong, says Rabbi Yeshua. Amalei Rabbi Eliezer loy. No, you can't compare chatas and oila to a pesach and a shlamim. Why? Because in mamarta b'chatas, shekein ksheiro. Lishma kol hashana kula. Yeah, the chatas has a weakness, has a tzad kula. Why? Because the chatas itself is kosher kol hashana kula. That's why if you shecht an oil l'shem chatas, it's not a problem because the chatas itself has a weakness. Timer b'Pesach, by Pesach, when you're talking about taking a korban shlomim and shechting in l'shem Pesach, here Pesach has a chumrah. She'en kosher l'shmei lebezmanoi. Right, it's only you can only bring it once a year. So hoilvu pasel l'shmai dinu shi paslu acherim l'shmai. Yeah. So since that itself becomes pasel when it's nishchat l'shem Pesach, dinu shi paslu acherim l'shmai. Yeah. So too it should paslu acherim l'shmai. Yeah, the Pesach itself becomes pasel l'shmai. When does it become pasel l'shmai? In January. If you try to take a Pesach yeshechted l'shmai in January, it's pasel. Right? So meaning it's only a specific time of the year that you can bring it. So therefore, since it has that chumrah, dinu sheyapaslu acherim l'shmai. Okay, wow, not an easy Gemara. Kitzur Amaisa, bottom line, we have Machlekes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, whether a person takes a shlomim, a shlomim on Erev Pesach, and he shechts it l'shem Pesach, a shlomim Erev Pesach l'shem Pesach, is it pasul, or is it still kosher l'shem shlomim? That's the Machlekes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, back and forth, in Svaras and Lamaisa. Rabbi Eliezer finally came up with a kal v'chomer. Rabbi Yeshua's pirch on the kal v'chomer, Rabbi Eliezer answered as well. So Rabbi Eliezer seems to run to the bank with this halacha that a shlomim sheshachtoi Erev Pesach l'shem Pesach is pasul. Okay, we learned the Mishnah Vayter Shimon Achi Azariah Omer. Yeah, Shimon Achi Azariah says that the din of Shaloi Lashma depends if you aim higher or lower than whatever the carbon is supposed to be. Right? If you take a kachim kalam and you shecht l'shem kachim kudashim, it's good. Vice versa is no good. Rav Ashi Masmei Rabbi Yochanan v'Acham bar Rav Masmei Rabbi Yanai. My taimo to Shimon Achi Azariah. How does he know it from? The Amar Kra. V'lichalu is kachim Yisrael sashirim el Hashem. Yeah, shouldn't be mechalol the kachim that Klal Yisrael is mafresh la Hashem. So you dash in the pasuk b'muran mehem ein mischalolin. If you are meirimit, if you elevate it to a higher category, then it's not mischalol. But namach men mischalim. So he has a drasha. Leichalalu is asher yurimu. If you aim higher, if you elevate the status, then it's not mischalol, and that's why kachim kalam the yishach shel lishma kachim kadishim. That's not an issue. That's where high lachi does. But like Shmuel, Shmuel benay loichas tavel shebemisa. Person eats tavel is misa b'dei shemayim. Shenem v'lechalus kachim b'nei Yisrael she'shirim ol Hashem. Pasidim litroi makasav medaber. Yeah, it means asher yurimu, future tense. Tevel is something that you're going to be meirim from, and there the einish is misa. So that's why I know tevel is misa. So the Gemara says in Kein L'chtukra asher hurmu. Yeah, Torah should have written asher hurmu. If it just would have taught me the din of Shimon Achi Azariah that you elevated it, why does it have to say future tense? Just say asher hurmu. My asher yurimu. The fact that it says the lashon harama, and it says it in future tense. Shmam and Atarti, I can learn both halachas. Let's go to the Mishnah. Boyer Reb Zera. Reb Zera asked the following shaila on Shimon Achi Azariah. Yeah, Shimon Achi Azariah again says that any carbon that you elevate to a higher status, even though it's shaloi lishma, it's not what you originally were magdish it for. It's okay. So Boyer Reb Zera ksherin ve'ein meratzen. When you elevated status, is it now meratza? In other words, he's cholik on two counts. Yeah, with Tanakama. Number one, that Tanakama doesn't hold of the svara of l'shem namach or l'shem gavoya b'chlal. And number two, Tanakama always holds that shaloi l'shma is only kosher. It's never meratza. Some wants to know, is he cholik also, is it meratza or not? Amar Bevitim Reb Zika Tashama. Bring your raya. The Mishnah says one of the examples Shimon Achi Azariah gave is Bechor Maser Sheshach L'Shlom Shlomim Ksherim. They're both Kachim Kalim. Yeah, Shlom Shach L'Shem Bechor L'Shem Maser Psulin. But if you take Shlomim L'Shem Bechor L'Shem Maser Psulin, why? Because Bechor and Maser is lower than Shlomim. Okay, Vizal K'taytach Ksherim and Meratzin Bechor Baritzuyehu. What kind of example is Bechor? Bechor is not a Ritzoy. Right? Bechor is Kodesh Merechem. It has nothing to do with being Meratza. It's not coming for Kapara B'chlal. It's Matnas Kuhuna. Elo Ksherin ve'ein Meratzin. So must be from this example that Shimon Achi Azariah gives, and he brings in Bechor, must be we're talking about the Ksherin ve'ein Meratzin that he's never argued on Tanakama on the point of Ritzoy. But the Sefer Ksherin ve'ein Meratzin, Reisha Nami Ksherin ve'ein Meratzin. The ratio of Kachim Kalam and Kachim Kodshim is also Ksherin ve'ein Meratzin. Where it says Midi Area Hakadisa v'Hakadisa. Maybe they're two separate statements. Yeah, maybe the first example Shimon Achi Azariah gave in the mission of Kachim Kalam and Kachim Kodshim, when he elevates the status of the Shaloi L'Shma from Kachim Kalam to Kachim Kodshim, maybe there he does hold that it's Meratza. So what is the Chiddush in the two examples, right? He gives us two different scenarios in the Mishnah. Gavoya v'namach kamashmala tanina keitzad kachim 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 kalim. Yeah, I already said it. Why do you have to give me again the example of Bechor and Maser Hashem Shlomim? So the Gemara says, "Ma'od atema kachim kachim kalim udeike gavoya v'namach aval kalim loy." Yeah, maybe kalim is not considered enough of a difference in status. You elevated the status so much, so maybe that's why you need the second.
What's Kalam?
Kalam is Shlomim to Bechor. They're both Kachim Kalam. They're really in the same category. Just a Shlomim has a certain Tesefes Kedusha. relative to Bechar and Maser. So if a person shechts, that was one of the examples in the Mishnah, somebody shechts a Bechar and a Maser L'Shem Shlamim, then that's considered, even though they're both Kachim Kalim, but that's considered elevating its status and it's kosher. And vice versa, if you take a Shlamim, Shech L'Shem Bechar and Maser, then you're downgrading it, you upgraded the downgrade. So the Gemara says, Hanami Tanina, if you're going to try to tell me that you can upgrade or downgrade even in the category of Kachim Kalim, Hanami Tanina. Shlamim koidmim esabachar neshetuhunim matan arba, usmicha nesachim nevaslev b'shaik. You see that the dam of the shlamim takes precedence when it comes to be put onto the mizbeach because it has matan arba. So you see that shlamim has more kedusha than a bechar, even though they're both kachim kalim. So why does Hashem and Achiyazar have to teach me that? In other words, it can't be that that's what he's teaching me, that there are differences in the kedusha between shlamim and bechar. So the Gemara says, "Ha'ikar." No, this is really the ikar chiddush. Ahi agrara nasba. That's agav. We already learned it in our Mishnah. The first Mishnah is Zvachim, so it's mentioning that as well, even though we know it from the first Mishnah. So bottom line is that when Shimon Achi Azariah says, when he says that anytime you upgrade it, if it's kosher, the Gemara wants to say it's kosher ve'ena meratza. Right? He doesn't hold that it's actually maratza.
So it doesn't function itself as the...
It's just an adava. It's like Tanakama that any Zvachim shenizbuchu shlolish mak ksherim, all the balam shem chayv. It's not maratza. It's an adava. You can bring it as an adava. Right. So let's say if you bring a bechar and a maser l'shem shlamim, right? That's the case. Bechar and maser l'shem shlamim, then you could still bring it as an adava, but it's not maratza. I wouldn't passel it, but it's not maratza. Huh? Okay.
We have 4.
Okay, we'll stop over here.